Good day, scholars and lovers of literature. Imagine your country is on the edge of dictatorship. One man has defeated every enemy. The army worships him. The people adore him. Tomorrow, he may accept the crown. You have only two choices. Do nothing and watch your centuries-old republic disappear, or assassinate the greatest hero. What would you do? This is the agonizing dilemma at the heart of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Was Caesar a dangerous tyrant? Or was he the victim of ambitious politicians claiming to defend freedom? And can political violence ever truly create liberty? More than 400 years later, these questions remain as relevant as ever. Although the play bears Caesar's name, the primary tragic arc belongs to Brutus, an honorable man who convinces himself that murder is a moral duty, only to unleash the very tyranny he died trying to prevent. This isn't just a story about ancient Rome. It's a chilling exploration of power, ambition, political propaganda, and the devastating cost of self-righteous idealism. Before we enter the play, we need to step back and understand the world that shaped it. In the 1st century ECE, Rome was not an empire ruled by an emperor. It was a republic governed by elected magistrates and the Senate. For nearly 5 centuries, Romans held a sacred dread of one single word: Rex, king. But as Rome conquered the Mediterranean, its wealth skyrocketed and its political system began to shatter. Victorious generals accumulated immense personal wealth and client armies loyal to them rather than to the Roman Senate. The Republic was rapidly turning into a battleground for warlords, and one man eventually outmaneuvered them all: Julius Caesar. Caesar was a brilliant military strategist, orator, and politician. His conquest of Gaul brought unprecedented wealth and territory to Rome, making him an idol to the common plebeians. In 49 ECE, when the Senate ordered him to lay down his command, Caesar made a fateful choice. He crossed the Rubicon River with his 13th legion, sparking a civil war against Pompey the Great. After crushing Pompey's forces across the Mediterranean, Caesar returned to Rome uncontested. In early 44 ECE, he was declared dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. To traditional senators, this was no longer a temporary wartime measure. It was a monarchy in everything but name. Now, let's fast forward 16 centuries. Shakespeare wrote Julius Caesar in 1599 to inaugurate his company's brand new theatre, the Globe. At the time, England was facing acute political anxiety. Queen Elizabeth I was in her late 60s, unmarried, childless, and steadfastly refused to name an heir. The English public lived in dread of a devastating civil war breaking out upon her death. Under Tudor censorship laws, openly debating royal succession on stage was strictly illegal. So Shakespeare did something brilliant. He turned to Roman history. Now, a common misconception is that Shakespeare was secretly advocating for revolution. That isn't true. To Elizabethan audiences, overthrowing an anointed ruler was a grave sin that brought cosmic chaos. By setting the play in Rome, Shakespeare wasn't attacking Elizabeth. He was issuing a stark warning to his contemporaries about the terrifying bloodshed that inevitably follows regicide and political instability. Shakespeare drew his historical material almost entirely from Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Grecians and Romans, translated into English by Sir Thomas North in 1579. Plutarch provided the historical spine, the assassination, the speeches, the battles, and the personal traits of the Romans. But Shakespeare provided the psychological depth, transforming historical records into a deeply human drama of conflicting motives, flawed logic, and moral paralysis. Here is one of the most brilliant structural choices in English literature. Julius Caesar is murdered halfway through the play, right at the beginning of Act 3. So why isn't the play called The Tragedy of Brutus? Because Caesar's spirit drives the entire second half of the drama. As a living man, Caesar is physically frail, deaf in one ear, and subject to epilepsy. But as a dead man, he becomes an unstoppable ideal. His assassination transforms him from a vulnerable dictator into an invincible martyr. The conspirators kill the man, but in doing so, they unleash Caesarism forever. Shakespeare opens the play not with noble senators, but with the common people celebrating Caesar's victory. Two tribunes, Flavius and Marulus, berate the crowd for their disloyalty, reminding them how fervently they used to cheer for Pompey. This scene establishes a crucial theme: the fickleness of the populace. In Shakespeare's Rome, the crowd's favor is like the wind, shifting instantly based on whoever commands their emotions. Among the festive crowd stands Caius Cassius. Cassius is deeply perceptive, politically sharp, and burning with resentment. He cannot stomach that a man he considers a physical equal or inferior has become godlike. Speaking directly to Brutus, Cassius delivers his famous Colossus speech. "Why, man, he doth bestride the narrow world. Like a colossus, and we petty men, walk under his huge legs and peep about to find ourselves dishonorable graves. Cassius understands that he lacks the public trust to lead a revolution alone. He needs Brutus, a man renowned for his moral integrity and his direct descent from Lucius Junius Brutus, who had expelled the ancient kings of Rome 5 centuries earlier. Marcus Brutus is a devoted Stoic. He loves Caesar as a personal friend and has received great honors from him. Yet he loves his ideal of Rome even more. Cassius manipulates Brutus not by appealing to envy, but by weaponizing Brutus's intense pride in his family heritage and his duty to the Republic. Brutus begins his tragic internal descent, choosing an abstract political ideology over real human love. Amid the noise of the Lupercalian festival, a voice cries out from the crowd, "Beware the Ides of March." Caesar stops, looks at the prophet and dismisses him. "He is a dreamer, let us leave him." Here, Shakespeare sets up the tension between fate, omens, and human arrogance. Caesar believes he is above mortal vulnerability. Shakespeare makes a deliberate choice to emphasize Caesar's physical weaknesses in Act 1. Cassius recalls saving a drowning Caesar from the Tiber River, describes him weeping like a sick girl during a fever in Spain, and notes that Caesar suffers from epilepsy and is deaf in his left ear. This presents a fascinating paradox. The Roman state treats Caesar as an immortal god, yet physically, he is as fragile as any other man. Act 1 concludes as a monstrous tempest descends upon Rome. Thunder crashes, fires rain from the sky, and Casca reports terrifying sights, a slave whose hand burned without burning the flesh, and a lion walking calmly past the Capitol. The storm mirrors both the internal turmoil in Brutus's mind and the unnatural breakdown of social order that the impending regicide will bring. Act 2 shifts from the public streets to the private garden. The storm still rages outside, but the true tempest is taking place inside Brutus's mind. No blood has yet been shed. The conspiracy can still be abandoned. By sunrise, however, Brutus will make a choice that seals his fate and Rome's destiny. Brutus delivers one of the most and logically problematic soliloquies in Shakespearean literature. He candidly admits that Caesar has done nothing wrong yet, stating, "And, to speak truth of Caesar, I have not known when his affections swayed more than his reason." Caesar has not abused his power. He has not dismantled the law. So how does Brutus justify killing him? Through a hypothetical analogy, he compares Caesar to a serpent's egg, arguing, "Think him as a serpent's egg, which hatched would, as his kind, grow mischievous, and kill him in the shell." Notice the fatal flaw. Brutus decides to assassinate a head of state not for crimes committed, but for a hypothetical future crime. He sacrifices a real human life to combat a theoretical possibility. Cassius knows that Brutus needs to feel the people are calling for help. So he writes fake letters, claiming to be citizens crying out against tyranny, and throws them through Brutus's window. Brutus reads these manufactured letters and believes he is fulfilling the public will. Shakespeare shows us how easily a noble mind can be manipulated by staged political propaganda. Before dawn, the conspirators enter Brutus' house, their faces disguised. Brutus takes charge of the group, but his insistence on absolute moral purity leads him to commit 2 disastrous strategic mistakes. First, he refuses an oath of loyalty, claiming their cause as Romans should be enough. Second, when Cassius wisely insists that Mark Antony must die alongside Caesar, Brutus overrides him. Brutus believes they can perform a surgical political intervention. It is a fatal. Antony will destroy them all. In the midst of political plotting, Shakespeare introduces Brutus' wife, Portia. She notices her husband's restless pacing and emotional distance, demanding to be treated as his intellectual equal. "I grant I am a woman, but withal, a woman well reputed, Cato's daughter. Think you I am no stronger than my sex, being so fathered and so husbanded?" To prove, she reveals a self-inflicted wound to her thigh. Brutus is moved by her devotion, yet the tragic irony remains. The man who claims to act for the public good cannot be honest with his lover. On the other side, Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, has suffered terrifying nightmares, dreaming she saw Caesar's statue running with blood while smiling Romans washed their hands in it. She begs Caesar not to go to the Senate, and Caesar initially agrees. Then enters Decius Brutus, historically Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's close generals whom Shakespeare mistakenly calls Decius. Decius uses psychological flattery. He reinterprets Calpurnia's dream favorably that Rome will draw reviving blood from Caesar's greatness. Then he whispers that the Senate intends to offer Caesar a crown today, and staying home might make him look cowardly. Caesar's pride overpowers his caution. He decides to walk to the Capitol. If Act 2 is the decision, Act 3 is the explosion. In this single act, Caesar is struck down, the conspiracy reaches its peak, and Mark Antony unleashes a rhetorical revolution that turns the Roman mob into a weapon of war. Caesar approaches the Capitol. 2 final opportunities to save his life present themselves. First, the soothsayer warns him again, reminding Caesar that the Ides of March are not yet gone. Second, a teacher named Artemidorus thrusts a paper into Caesar's hand containing the explicit names of all the conspirators. Caesar pushes it aside, declaring, "What touches ourselves shall be last served." The conspirators encircle Caesar under the pretense of petitioning for the recall of Metellus Cimber's exiled brother. When Caesar arrogantly refuses, comparing his own stability to the northern star, Casca strikes the first blow. "Speak, hands, for me!" The assassins attack in a frenzied circle. When Caesar sees his beloved Brutus draw his dagger, he stops fighting and utters his final words. "Et tu, Brute?" Then falls Caesar. Now, historically, Caesar did not say "et tu, Brute." That Latin phrase was invented by Elizabethan dramatists. Ancient historians like Suetonius report that if Caesar said anything, it was in Greek. "Kesu, teknon? You too, my child?" Regardless, Caesar falls dead at the base of Pompey's statue. A brilliant moment of poetic justice, as the ruler who defeated Pompey dies at the feet of his former rival. In an astonishing act of ritualistic delusion, Brutus commands the assassins, "Stoop, Romans, stoop, and let us bathe our hands in Caesar's blood, up to the elbows, and besmear our swords." Brutus genuinely believes this makes them holy sacrificers, rather than common murderers. Cassius looks into the future and utters a meta-theatrical line. "How many ages hence shall this our lofty scene be acted over, in states unborn and accents yet unknown?" Mark Antony enters the Senate floor, sees Caesar's body, and feigns submission to the conspirators, shaking each of their bloody hands. But when left alone with the corpse, he reveals his true intention. "Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war." He asks permission to speak at Caesar's funeral. Cassius fiercely opposes this, but Brutus permits it, demanding only that he speak first to explain their cause. "Not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more. The crowd is pacified, so unthinking, in fact, that they shout, 'Let him be Caesar.'" They fail to understand his anti-monarchical ideals completely. Then Mark Antony steps forward carrying Caesar's body, speaking passionate blank verse. He calls Brutus an honorable man with growing sarcasm, holds up Caesar's blood-ost mantle pointing to every dagger tear, and reveals Caesar's will leaving private land and money to the citizens. Brutus offered abstract logic, but Antony offered emotional proof. The crowd explodes into violent fury, rushing to burn the conspirators' houses. In the chaos, a mob brutally murders an innocent poet named Cinna simply because he shares a name with Cinna the conspirator. Law and order have completely collapsed. The conspirators killed Caesar to stop a tyrant. Instead, their actions create a bloody power vacuum filled by men far more ruthless than Caesar. Act 4 opens with Mark Antony, Caesar's young heir Octavius, and the general Lepidus forming the second triumvirate. Historically, this happened months later, but Shakespeare condenses time for dramatic impact. They do not govern through law, they govern through death lists, executing hundreds of political rivals to seize their property and fund their armies. Antony casually sacrifices his own nephew, and the moment Lepidus leaves the room, Antony dismisses him as a tool to be discarded once his usefulness ends. Meanwhile, the conspirators have fled Rome and raised armies in the east. Inside Brutus's tent at Sardis, the unity of the conspiracy shatters. Brutus accuses Cassius of taking bribes, asking, "Shall we, that struck the foremost man of all this world, but for supporting robbers, shall we now contaminate our fingers with base bribes?" Cassius, furious and hurt, draws his dagger and offers it to Brutus, telling him to strike his heart as he struck Caesar's. The argument highlights the core tragedy. Brutus tried to keep his hands clean in a corrupt world, while Cassius realized civil war requires dirty money. They reconcile, but their cause is already doomed. After their argument, Brutus reveals a devastating secret. Portia is dead. Overwhelmed by grief and fear of Antony's growing power, she swallowed burning coals. Brutus hides his grief behind rigid stoic composures. But that night, as Brutus sits reading in his tent, the candle burns dim, an Elizabethan sign that a spirit is near. The ghost of Caesar appears, delivering a chilling message. "Thy evil spirit, Brutus," whether a supernatural apparition or a projection of guilt, the message is clear. Caesar's spirit will have its revenge. The final act brings us to the battlefield of Philippi. Here, all philosophical arguments cease, and the tragic consequences of the conspiracy are resolved in blood. Before war, Brutus, Cassius, Antony, and Octavius meet between the armies. Instead of negotiating, it descends into bitter insults. Antony calls Brutus a hypocrite who smiled like a flatterer while stabbing Caesar, and Cassius reminds Brutus that Antony would not be alive today if Brutus had listened to his advice in Act 2. The battle begins. Shakespeare compresses the two battles of Philippi into a single day. Brutus's forces defeat Octavius's wing, but Brutus fails to support Cassius, whose camp is overrun by Antony's troops. Cassius sends his officer Titinius to check on distant troops. From a hill, Cassius's servant mistakenly reports that Titinius has been captured. Overcome with despair and acting on false information, Cassius orders his servant to run him through with the very sword he used to stab Caesar. He dies exclaiming, "Caesar, thou art revenged, even with the sword that killed thee." When Titinius returns, having actually been greeted by victorious friendly troops, he kills himself out of grief over Cassius' body. Realizing the battle is lost and seeing Caesar's ghost appear to him once more, Brutus accepts his end. Refusing to be paraded through Rome in chains, he asks a loyal follower to hold his sword while he runs upon it. His final words acknowledge his tragic trajectory. Caesar, now be still, I killed not thee with half so good a will. Brutus dies with far more willingness than he felt when he raised his blade against his friend. Antony and Octavius find Brutus' body. Standing over his fallen enemy, Mark Antony delivers a famous final tribute. This was the noblest Roman of them all. All the conspirators save only he did that they did in envy of great Caesar. He only, in a general honest thought and common good to all, made one of them. Antony recognizes the core tragedy. Cassius acted out of personal envy, but Brutus acted out of genuine love for the Republic. Octavius commands that Brutus be buried with full military honors, and the play ends as Octavius orders the retreat, signaling the dawn of his own absolute rule as Augustus Caesar, the first emperor of Rome. The play begins with Caesar at the height of his influence, and it ends with his heir preparing to rule an empire. The conspirators killed Julius Caesar to preserve Roman democracy, yet their violence directly destroyed the very republic they sought to save. Shakespeare leaves us with a timeless, unsettling truth. Political violence driven by pure abstract idealism rarely produces liberty. It produces chaos, military dictatorship, and regret. In the end, Caesar loses his life, Brutus loses his honor and his soul, and Rome loses its freedom forever. That is why Julius Caesar remains a timeless warning about the fragility of democracy and the terrifying cost of choosing the wrong means for the right ends.
If you found this analysis helpful, do share it with fellow literature students, and I look forward to seeing you in our next lecture on another great work of literature. Until next time, keep reading critically and thinking deeply. Thank you for watching.